The whispers in town hit different when they saw who started rolling with you. That one person everybody avoided. Rumors of their past made shopkeepers look the other way, made neighbors lower their voices when they walked by. The same one who could clear out a diner just by stepping inside. Now they're leaning against your truck outside the gas station, cracking jokes like they've known you forever. People at the cafe steal glances as they slide into the booth across from you, laughing at something only you understand. The same face that once made folks cross the street now lights up every time you walk into the room. And nobody in this town can figure out how you did it. You didn't even try, just treated them like a regular person while the whole town was busy whispering behind their backs and avoiding eye contact. Now, folks at the diner pause mid-coffee sip, watching in disbelief as the most feared name in town leans against your locker, carrying your books like it's second nature. That same person who used to make parents clutch their kids' hands tighter is now saving you a seat at the football game, acting like your right hand. And the whole town, they don't know whether to be confused, impressed, or downright terrified. Then something about you was different, and they tried again, got closer, let the full weight of their energy drop like an iron cage. The pressure alone had forced hardened criminals into sobbing confessions. But you barely blinked. Your heartbeat never even changed. This had never happened before. And that's when something unexpected twisted inside them. For the first time in their life, they felt the one thing they had spent years erasing from their system: doubt. The finely sharpened edges of their mind dulled, the control they held over their own reactions slipping through their fingers. You weren't afraid, you weren't affected, and worse, you weren't trying to prove anything, you just were, a presence that stood unmoved in the face of a predator. And that's when their obsession began. And it started as curiosity. They needed to know why. They wanted to see what it would take to make you flinch. They pushed, tested, circled, but each attempt backfired harder than the last. Instead of breaking you, they were the ones unraveling. Instead of drawing fear from you, they felt something entirely foreign. And for the first time, power wasn't something they were wielding. It was something pulling them toward you. The laws of their world were changing. And because the one who ruled with fear was now experiencing it. Not fear of you, no. Fear of what they were becoming. Fear of the fact that for the first time, they wanted something they couldn't control. And that something was you. You didn't follow the rules, didn't play the game. You weren't waiting to be moved across their board, weren't interested in their carefully woven traps. You weren't trying to win, or worse, trying to impress them. And that was the first crack in their strategy. And they tested you, laid out the same mind games that had crumbled even the strongest. They spoke in half-truths, in layered meanings, in silences designed to make people second-guess themselves. But you saw through it, met their words with nothing but steady eyes and unshaken presence. And you weren't manipulated, you weren't intimidated, and you weren't even interested in playing. And that was when they realized the unthinkable. For the first time, they were the one unsure of their next move, the one calculating and recalculating, trying to find an angle, trying to regain the upper hand. But there wasn't one. Because the moment they started trying to control the situation, trying to predict you, trying to understand why you weren't bending to their rules, and they had already lost, they were unraveling in real time. And the worst part, you weren't even trying to make it happen, and you weren't out to break them, you weren't out to prove a point. You were just you, unmoved, uninterested in their power plays, immune to the kind of control that had kept their world in check. And they had conquered minds, empires, and the most dangerous of hearts, and you conquered them without even knowing it. And for the first time in their life, the most ruthless strategist, the master manipulator, the one who never lost and had just been checkmated, and you knew who they were. The way their words could cut deeper than any knife. The way their presence alone could ruin a person's sense of self, shatter confidence like glass. They had made a name for themselves in destruction, tearing people apart without lifting a single finger. A smirk, a glance, a single sentence laced with just enough venom to corrode someone's soul. But when it came to you, into nothing landed. They threw their sharpest daggers, disguised as words meant to make you stumble, second-guess, feel. But you didn't flinch. You didn't shrink under the weight of their mind games. Didn't scramble for their approval. Didn't dance around their mood shifts like everyone else did. You didn't feed them the reaction they were so used to pulling out of people. And that was their first mistake, thinking you were like everyone else. They watched, waiting for the moment you would crack, waiting for the sting of their words to sink in, for your energy to shift, for you to finally react, but you didn't. You met their poison with silence, with an energy that stood unmoved, like a force they couldn't touch. And for the first time, the game felt off, not broken, not unfinished, just different. And so they tried again, a sharper comment, a calculated silence, a look designed to make you question everything, and yet still you stood, still you remained, and something inside them shifted. And they weren't sure when it happened, when the game stopped being about making you fall and started being about understanding why you wouldn't. They had spent a lifetime learning how to tear people down, but for the first time they were trying to build something, to keep something, and to keep you. And that realization terrified them. And you didn't fight them, you didn't run, you didn't even push back. And that was the problem. They had spent their entire life tearing through people like a wildfire, leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. Their power wasn't just in their hands. It was in the way people reacted to them, the way their presence made people scramble, bargain, shatter, the way fear gave them control before they even had to lift a finger. And you just stood there, and unmoved, unshaken, unafraid. And in that, it sent something sharp and unfamiliar through their chest. And they circled you, tested you, loomed over you with the kind of energy that could bend a lesser soul into submission. They let the full weight of their darkness press against you, waiting for the moment your breath would hitch, your stance would shift, your eyes would betray even the smallest crack of fear. And nothing, and not even a flicker. They tried again, harder. This time, sharpening their presence into something lethal, something unbearable. But all that power, all that suffocating dominance, and it just rolled off you like smoke. And that was when they realized what was happening. And it wasn't that you were resisting, it wasn't that you were fighting back, and it was that you simply didn't fear them. Not because you were naive, not because you were reckless, because you saw them. And not the monster, not the legend, not the beast that haunted the nightmares of the wicked. And you saw them, because for the first time in their life, the fear they had spent years carving into others, the fear that built their empire, that kept the world at their feet, was now their own. But it wasn't fear of you, and it was fear of losing you. And that was a kind of terror they had never been prepared to face. None. They had always been destruction, a force of nature, raw and untamed. Wherever they went, things moved. People scrambled, bowed, shattered under the weight of their presence. They didn't need to lift a finger. They were the storm, unpredictable, violent, impossible to contain. And then there was you. You didn't move, didn't waver, didn't brace for impact, and you stood. They had seen people try to survive them before, had seen people attempt to tame them, to soften them, to mold their chaos into something easier to swallow. Those people always failed, always ended up drowning in the hurricane they thought they could control. And you weren't trying to control them, you weren't trying to change them, you weren't trying to do anything at all. And you simply existed. And that changed everything. As their energy crashed into you like a tidal wave, expecting to drown you, to pull you under like it had done to everyone else. But instead of fighting, instead of thrashing, when you let it break around you, no struggle, no resistance, no fear. They had spent their life forcing the world to bend, to shift, to react. But you refused to be moved. Not out of stubbornness, not out of defiance, but because you didn't need to. You were something they had never encountered before. Not fragile, not reckless, just unshakable. And for the first time, their chaos, the very thing that defined them, didn't know what to do. And it couldn't consume you, couldn't destroy you. So it changed, and shifted, and softened, and not for the world, not for anyone else, just for you. The storm that had once swallowed cities, that had torn through souls without a second thought, and turned to rain. And the scariest part? They weren't even fighting it. They had seen it all, and the rise and fall of empires. The darkest corners of the human mind, the depths people would sink to for power, for survival, for vengeance. They had played in shadows so deep, even light feared to enter. Nothing surprised them, nothing moved them. And then you happened, and for the first time, they felt something they couldn't name. And your energy wasn't like the rest. It wasn't desperate, it wasn't fragile. It wasn't something they could break, manipulate, or corrupt. And it was pure. Not naive, not weak, but untouched by the sickness that ruled their world. And you didn't fight for attention, didn't try to prove yourself. You just were. And that was what wrecked them. And because they had spent a lifetime ruining things, into burning bridges, poisoning souls, hollowing out everything in their path. That was how it always worked. That was what they knew. Until you and they had no instinct for this. No blueprint for how to handle someone they didn't want to break. And they wanted to protect you. And that was dangerous. And because they had never protected anything before, Sen people were disposable. Things could be replaced. Attachments were weaknesses, and weaknesses got people killed. And you weren't disposable. And you weren't replaceable. And you weren't something they could afford to lose. And that realization hit them harder than any bullet ever could. And because for the first time in their life, they didn't just want to have something, and they wanted to preserve it. And they wanted to preserve you. They ruled with absolute power. No questions, no hesitation, no mercy. And their word dictated life or death. One glance could sentence a man to ruin. A single command could shake entire networks, make seasoned killers fall in line. The world they built was held together by fear, unshaken, unquestioned, unchallenged. And then you walked in. And you weren't looking for them. You weren't interested in the weight their name carried, the legends whispered about them in hushed voices. You didn't flinch when others did, didn't drop your gaze when their eyes locked on yours. You didn't fear them, not because you were reckless, but because you saw something no one else did. And that was the beginning of the shift. And at first, their people ignored it, assumed you'd be another temporary distraction, another piece in. A game they had long mastered, but then the whispers started. They weren't the same around you, and they weren't quick to shut you down. They weren't commanding the room like they always did. The untouchable leader, the one who dictated fate with a flick of the wrist, now hesitated just for a moment, but long enough for their people to notice. And in this world, hesitation meant weakness. Their most loyal followers exchanged uneasy glances, watched them watching you instead of ruling, with the same cold precision they always had. Enemies sharpened their focus, sensing a vulnerability they had never seen before. They could have denied it, could have dismissed the shift, buried it under layers of control and calculated power plays. But it was already too late, and because their people weren't just noticing a change, and they were witnessing a revolution. A force even greater than fear had entered the equation. And the most terrifying part, silence, and they didn't care. And they didn't care that their iron grip was loosening, that their control was slipping into something unfamiliar. They didn't care that people were whispering, speculating, questioning. Because when they looked at you, when they stood in your presence, nothing else mattered. And for the first time in their reign, power wasn't the only thing they wanted. And they wanted you. And that alone was enough to reshape the world they had built. They say the truth will set you free, but most can't handle it. For the chosen ones in the obsidian inner order, it's not just the truth, it's the whole cosmic download. No sugarcoating, no escape. And picture this. Weekly group. Calls with 450 plus chosen ones, recorded and available anytime for your enlightenment. Our private Discord. It's not just active, it's alive, buzzing with ideas, breakthroughs, and that unstoppable chosen energy. Oh, and for you romantics out there, welcome to Chosen Singles, where soulmates meet under cosmic alignments, not cheap pickup lines. And for the seekers, dive into modern manifestation mechanics, our exclusive grimoire, with 3 chapters available to members. Learn how to turn your home into an abundance magnet, master basic spellcraft for physical manifestation, and channel magical forces to elevate your goals. Plus, you'll get access to interviews with real targeted individuals and video specials so bold, the YouTube archons don't even want you to see them. This is more than a membership. It's a movement. So what are you waiting for? Stop searching, start ascending. The link is in the description. They never hesitated before. And breaking people was second nature. Hurting, discarding, moving on, that was survival. Attachments were weapons waiting to be used against them, and weakness, that was the one thing they had never allowed themselves to have. And so why, when it came to you, did everything feel different? They could cut anyone off, erase them from existence without a second thought. Cold, calculated, ruthless. That's what they were. That's what had kept them alive. What had built their empire. What had ensured no one would ever hold power over them. But then you showed up. And suddenly, the rules they had lived by, the rules they had enforced without mercy, were breaking in real time. They told themselves you were no different. That if it ever came to it, if you ever crossed them, they would do what they always did. They lied. Because when you looked at them, really looked at them, not with fear, not with admiration, not with the desperate need to impress, but with something deeper, they felt something they couldn't name. They had walked away from everyone before, left without guilt, without remorse, watched people fall apart and felt nothing. And you weren't disposable, you weren't replaceable. And no matter how hard they tried to convince themselves otherwise, the truth was undeniable. They could hurt anyone, ruin them, leave them bleeding and begging and never look back. But not you. Never you. They had built walls high enough to keep the entire world out, perfected the art of staying untouchable. But somehow, without even trying, you had stepped through, untouched by their venom, unmoved by their reputation, unchanged by their darkness. And you didn't ask for anything, didn't try to tame them, to fix them, to make them something softer. And you just existed. And that alone was enough. But enough to shift something inside them, enough to make them hesitate, enough to make them afraid. Not afraid of losing control, afraid of losing you. Because for the first time, the person who could destroy anything, who could walk away from anyone, who had spent their entire life proving they needed no one, and had finally found the one person they couldn't bear to lose. They were still feared, still ruthless, still the same force of nature that had built their world in blood and silence. They didn't change. They couldn't. But something did shift. And because now their danger wasn't meant for you. It was meant for anyone who thought they could touch you. And you felt it the moment you stepped into their world. The air around you wasn't suffocating, not like it was for others. Their presence, the same presence that had made powerful men tremble, didn't press against you like an unspoken threat. It wrapped around you like a shield. The same hands that had destroyed without hesitation, now they only reached for you, with care. The same voice that had issued orders like death sentences, now it softened when it spoke your name. But make no mistake, they hadn't become soft, and their enemies still feared them. Their people still obeyed them without question. The world still whispered their name in caution, still knew the weight of their presence, still understood that crossing them meant war. But crossing you, and that meant something worse. And because you weren't just someone they cared about, and you were sacred. And in a world where power was everything, where loyalty was bought and sold, where love was nothing but a weakness waiting to be exploited, you were untouchable. And not because you fought for it, not because you demanded it, but because they wouldn't allow anything less. You didn't realize at first, didn't see the way their people watched you differently, how conversations would shift the moment you walked into a room, how the ones who had once spoken freely now hesitated, now measured their words, now understood that your presence alone could change everything. And they saw it before you did. You weren't just someone they protected, and you were the one thing they would burn the world for. And if anyone was foolish enough to test that, then well, there's a reason people still fear their name. They talk about you in whispers now. Your name isn't just spoken, it's studied. Like a legend too unreal to be true, like a myth people can't decide whether to fear or admire. Because what happened should have been impossible. And the most feared, the most ruthless, the untouchable, devoted.nn to you. It wasn't just a love story. It was a shift in power, a rewriting of the rules that had governed their world for as long as anyone could remember. And they had never bowed, never hesitated, never looked at anyone like they mattered. And then you walked in. And somehow, without lifting a single finger, without asking for a single thing, you became the exception to everything they had built their empire upon. And there, people saw it first, the subtle shift in their demeanor, the unspoken change in their presence, the way their gaze lingered too long on you, the way they listened when you spoke. That wasn't normal. That wasn't them. And that's why the streets started talking, and the legend was breaking, and you were the reason. No one could explain it. No one could understand it. And how did you, someone they never planned for, someone they never even considered a piece in their game, become the only thing that could make them pause? The rumors twisted, stretched, grew into something bigger than truth, and some said you bewitched them. Some said you held a power greater than theirs. Some whispered that you had done the impossible, tamed the untamable. But the truth, and you didn't tame anything, and you weren't trying to change them, fix them, or break them, and you were simply you. And that was what ruined them. And because they had spent a lifetime knowing exactly who they were. And then you came along, and they were someone else. Not softer, not weaker, just different, not because they lost control, but because for the first time they chose to give it. You weren't searching for them. You weren't strategizing, bending, or molding yourself to fit into their world. You weren't another desperate soul grasping for power, approval, or survival. You were simply you. And that was the problem. And because they had seen every kind of person before, those who begged, those who fought, those who thought they could outmaneuver them. None of them ever mattered. None of them ever lasted. You weren't trying to last. You weren't trying at all. And that is what unmade them. Every force they had mastered, every tool they had used to keep themselves untouchable, every instinct that had shielded them from vulnerability, all of it collapsed in your presence. Not because you forced it, not because you played a smarter game, and then because you didn't play at all. And you never needed to. They could rationalize every other conquest, every other obsession, every other move in their life. But not you. You didn't fit into their equations. You didn't respond the way people were supposed to. You didn't give them the reaction they had been conditioned to expect. And you just were. And that's why the strongest, deadliest force to ever exist fell without a fight. They lost before they even realized the game had begun. And now, the world is still reeling. Their people whisper. Their enemies watch with careful unease. The ones who thought they understood power now understand nothing. NN because you did what no one else could. And without trying, without bending, without breaking. Now, let's talk about it. Have you ever noticed how people change around you? Have you ever seen someone struggle to define what you are to them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell the world what it's like to be the force they never saw coming.